Hour now at 2 past, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today to discuss navigating vaccine mandates in home care. We've brought together some really phenomenal industry experts today to share their insights, how they're confronting these mandates, and then any guidance and resources that they recommend for us as they work through it and we work through it too. Thanks so much, Meredith, for bumping us to the next slide. Before we get started, I want to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording of this webinar will be shared after the event, and we will be taking in questions, so be sure to chat in your questions, and we will be answering those when we get to the Q&A section here after our introductions. So please do share your curiosities with us. We'd love to discuss them today. Thanks, Meredith. Next slide. Today, we've got the three great panelists, Kevin Smith, Moe, and Kiana. My name is Erica. I'm the Director of Science and Policy Development here at Care Academy, where we work to provide caregiver training that is compliant in every geo that we come across, really. Next slide, please. Kevin Smith is the CEO and owner of Best of Care Incorporated, a non-medical home care agency that employs more than 400 home care aides across Massachusetts. Best of Care is a private, family-owned and operated home care agency approaching its 40th year in operation. He's also the board president of the Home Care Council, a nonprofit trade association in Massachusetts that represents 70+ home care agency and tens of thousands of home care aides. Smith has contributed his thoughts and insights on the home care industry to a number of publications and media outlets, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. Next slide. Moe Njago Robin is an RN, BSN, CPHQ with a history of success in areas such as leadership, operations, quality, process improvement, infection control, workforce development, and risk management. During the onset of the pandemic, she led a behavioral health hospital system in the development of COVID-19 policies and procedures. She currently provides consulting services to assist clients interested in operationalizing their return to office vaccine policies. And finally, Kiana James has obtained her BBA in Entrepreneurship and Management from the Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. She is a graduate of prestigious Civia and Melvin Wolf Center for Entrepreneurship, the #1 entrepreneurial program in the US. In 2010, she formed Friendly Faces Senior Care, which provides private pay in-home caregiver services for seniors. Friendly Faces Senior Care has been granted several awards, including Provider of Choice, Employer of Choice, Top Home Care for Houston Award Incorporated, 5,000 Fastest Growing Companies in America, the BBA Award of Excellence, and Houston Chronicle's Top Workplaces Award. She currently serves on the board of CAP of Houston, CAP of Pearland, the executive board for the Pearland Chamber of Commerce, and the advisory board for the Pearland Chamber of Commerce, and the advisory board for the Independent Home Care Alliance. In addition, she is involved in several philanthropic endeavors throughout the city of Houston and in surrounding areas. We'll take a quick moment to talk about Care Academy. Care Academy is an end-to-end scalable training solution that transforms home care and home health businesses into efficient industry leaders. More than 200,000 direct care workers are learning and growing professionally through Care Academy, engaging with our online, mobile-friendly platform. Our platform integrates the leading home care agency software. Our caregiver training is eligible for college credit through our partnership with Southern New Hampshire University. And we recently added more than 70 continuing education courses for nurses and more than 30 continuing education courses for agency administrators to our training library. Moving into our Q&A section, we'll start with a question for Kevin and Kiana. As agency owners, what vaccination rates are you seeing amongst your staff, and what do you predict?
I can start. I was very afraid when this all happened, but we did take a survey within our company, and I was surprised to find out about 75% of our staff was already vaccinated. And so we still have a few to work with, especially if these mandates will continue and be final. But what I'm predicting that will happen will be some caregivers may just decide to leave the industry altogether. But I think with the newer mandates that will be applying to employers that have 100 plus employees, I think it'll be less choices for people to actually find a job that's not requiring the mandates. So I think that might actually help benefit us here in home care. And so we'll be able to retain more of the caregivers than initially what we thought of when this happened.
So like Kiana, I was also very anxious when we received the mandate here in Massachusetts. We received the mandate notification from Governor Baker's office in early September, and there is a October 31st deadline. So not a ton of runway for providers to meet that goal and meet that timeline. As of about 5 minutes before this webinar, I requested an update from our team. We're at 80% of active staff who are now vaccinated. 1 week ago, today, we were at 63%. So I think we're seeing a lot of human nature. You know, human nature is to stall, to delay, to wait, and to procrastinate, whether that was just submission of a vaccine record that somebody has been sitting on, you know, since July, June, or spring, or somebody who went out and got dose one. So I am encouraged to see that the vaccination records at our company are starting to trickle in with more frequency as we move towards the deadline.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting. And I know that there are a lot of state-specific implications involved. You know, we've got the federal vaccine mandate, which we have yet to see be rolled out by OSHA and CMS respectively. And then we've got state-specific mandates, as you alluded to, Kevin. There are some in Massachusetts that you guys are confronting deadlines with, and maybe you're seeing vaccine numbers shift as a result. Kiana, we found out just before the webinar that Texas implemented a new rule this week. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and how you're working through it?
Yes, just to have further anxiety around all of this. Our Governor Abbott, he put an executive order, which basically says that employers or any entities cannot require a vaccine mandate. And it was on 3 different criteria. If someone didn't want it because of religious reasons and because of medical reasons, which was pretty common all over. But the third reason was personal conscience, which that's a category that many people can claim. So it was very, very interesting because now as business owners, we're kind of caught in the middle between state mandates and federal mandates. And so obviously, I think the winners in all of this are the lawyers because we're definitely having to get with them and get their advice. I was on a call yesterday trying to figure out, okay, what do we do as business owners? Do we follow what the governor is saying? Do we follow what the president is saying? And both of them have penalties. With the executive order, there's going to be some type of fine, $1,000. We don't know if that means per employee, per instance. Federally, they talked about there being a fine of like, I think up to 14,000. So it's really a lot that we're having to deal with and really just upping our anxiety levels.
It's challenging, the idea of having to navigate 2 conflicting pieces of legislation, both of which seem to be as important as the next. And I'm hearing that it's anxiety inducing, as we can all imagine and are experiencing ourselves. And that so far, what you've been doing to work through it is work with your legal team and find solutions specific to you and your business, just to find the most compliant path forward. We have a couple of questions coming in already. One question is, are you asking for vaccination cards specifically, or is there some other proof that you're looking at? And then in tandem, are you looking at exemptions, and how are you working through that as well?
We are asking for vaccination cards the same way we would keep their other vaccination and other required information, medical information in a private folder. And then as far as exemptions, you don't have to specifically ask them for the exemption, but if they tell you that they don't want to take it because of an exemption, then you have to provide reasonable accommodation to be in compliance with like the ADA. But we do have it in our policy, which they have access to, that we can provide accommodations if they need some type of exemption because of that.
We are also getting the vaccine cards from the staff. There is a religious and a medical exemption here in Massachusetts that employees can seek if they are not going to be vaccinated. And so the bigger question that came up here in Massachusetts, well, what is an accommodation? What does that look like? So if a person is unvaccinated, but does have a religious or medical exemption, what type of accommodation does an employer need to provide for that worker to continue providing client-facing direct care? And there were a number of interpretations. The prevailing sentiment amongst providers was, if people are forced to go to a weekly testing regimen, for example, who is on the hook for that expense? Is it the employee who doesn't want to get vaccinated but has an exemption? Or is it the employer? And if it's the employer, where will they be able to go to seek reimbursement? Will it be through the state? Will it be through the feds? And so everybody has been navigating, the murkiness of those questions in that situation with their own counsel. But I think that the prevailing sentiment is that a lot of people will be working on November 1st with an exemption without being vaccinated, but wearing their PPE and doing exactly what they're doing today to be safe with their clients. Now, the one thing that we haven't touched yet is, we're talking about federal mandates, we're talking about state mandates, and maybe we'll get here. We haven't touched on what the market mandates. We all know that our clients are looking for vaccinated workers. How many people are getting a client emailing or calling and saying, you know what, I actually want an unvaccinated worker? Don't think so. We're not getting those calls. They don't exist. So unfortunately for the staff who are not seeking vaccines in a state like Massachusetts, there is no shelter left. There's nowhere to go unless you can find somebody who has under 100 employees that is somehow not subject to this vaccine mandate. There's nowhere left. So I think a lot of people are realizing that now, with 2 weeks to go before the 31st.
Really interesting, and that kind of dovetails into the next couple of questions. Kevin, Kiana, what is the rule when you reach that deadline? And I guess it's more applicable to Kevin working in Massachusetts with that November 1 deadline. What are you going to do? I mean, you told us what the unvaccinated workers who have exemptions will do, and we know what the vaccinated workers will do. What happens to the rest?
They're gone. They're on the bench as of 10/31. Doesn't mean they're not employed. It just means that they cannot go to work. And so we know that in the month of November, we will likely see some people reverse course when it really sinks in that they can't work and that this wasn't for show, that it is a real deadline that has implications. And so we know that we've already lost some staff. We've already received resignations from a number of people. And more importantly, I think it's less about the impact it's going to have on, my company alone. The network itself here in Massachusetts is already totally stressed due to the workforce crisis. And it's only going to get exacerbated if we see 10% of home care aides walk and no longer go to work on November 1st. There's going to be a lot of unfilled cases. There'll be hospitalizations. There'll be ER trips. The ripple effect will be substantial, but we're not going to really see that, until mid-November, Thanksgiving, December.
It's interesting because you hear percentages is like 90 and you think, oh my gosh, that's so good. But what you're pointing out, Kevin, is that there's that delta of 10% and we don't really have room to lose 10%. We were already strapped to begin with. And that the effects of that have yet to be seen. So I pose to you, Kiana, were you surprised to see 70% vaccination rate amongst your staff? Were you hoping, I imagine, for more, or how are you looking at that number?
Since it's such a touchy subject and everybody has an opinion and there's so much information and misinformation, I really expected it to be less than 75%. And so when it was, I was happy to see that, just because this is something that we're being mandated to do. And so I know I'm like, we don't want to have to fight with our caregivers. We don't want to have to let caregivers go. We really, as business owners, don't want to be in this position, but we are, and it is a reality. So when I saw it was 75%, that brought my anxiety level down a little bit, because at least if we are actually forced to do this, we don't have so many people that it's going to be affected towards. So
I want to turn the questions over to Moe. You work pretty explicitly across state lines and with many different types of agencies. So we've had some specific insights, from Kevin and Kiana in Massachusetts and Texas, respectively. What are you seeing, Moe?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So actually, I am working nationwide, like you said, but in not only healthcare, but in various industries. And so I believe, Kiana, you said earlier, more industries outside of healthcare are requiring the either the vaccine or going through some sort of exemption or accommodation process. And that's absolutely what my experience has been working with my clients. Truly the priority here is supporting organizations in navigating their vaccine requirements and the accommodation process, like I mentioned. And then their concerns are about the implications of losing their workforce and how to protect their stakeholders, like we've been discussing. So truly the focus has been about making the process work best for them and their employees to reduce their risks.
It's really interesting. We have a question that's come in regarding OSHA. Do we know when OSHA, or even, because OSHA's going to be the guidance for private companies of more than 100 employees by way of the federal mandate, and CMS will be the guidance authority for healthcare association or healthcare organizations under the federal mandate. To date, we don't know when OSHA or CMS will be rolling out that guidance, that federal guidance. Last I saw, it's still on their table. They still have to build it out, and the websites still are pretty quiet about what to expect there. So I would imagine that those groups are working on that guidance, probably in close conjunction with the CDC. You can definitely look to Care Academy to provide and share updates as those deadlines become known and shared more broadly. Another question for Kevin and Kiana. Are you and how are you pushing for vaccines? And I know that pushing is a strong word. I know that a lot of times the approach with respect and having a conversation and encouragement, what tools are you using to communicate with your care staff and encourage compliance?
I think having a conversation and understanding, what's driving this. I think Kevin said something about earlier how many people, they're not opposed to the vaccination, they're just kind of holding out. So in those cases, it might be a little bit easier to convince them, okay, go ahead and do this, because they don't really have an objection. So I was surprised to find that many that I talked to was just holding out. Those are the easier cases, but there are a lot of people where this is a very hot topic, understandably. So one of the things that I try to focus on when I'm having that conversation is listening and finding out, what do they feel? Why do they feel that way? And kind of where this is coming from. Want to make sure that, because this in many cases can be life and death decisions when it has to deal with COVID and people's health and people's, feelings inside. So understanding why it is that they feel and making sure that the information is actual factual information. I think that's very, very important. I said earlier, there's so much misinformation on, doesn't matter what side you're on, there's a lot of misinformation all over the place as it pertains to COVID. So making sure they really, really understand, okay, these are the facts, these are statistics, let's go by that information and then make that decision. Because ultimately they have to make a decision of what they want to do. Do they want to put this in their body? Do they not? Do they want to keep their job? Do they not? And then just, having that conversation and trying to be a support system for them through this.
So we have, just like Kiana laid out, had so many of those conversations with staff. And really the first thing that I personally made clear in all of my own communication company-wide was, this is not a best of care mandate. I was always of the mind that I was not going to issue an employer mandate. I didn't think that that would do us any good to try and tell people what they should or should not do. Now, ultimately, we got a state mandate. And so the conversation shifted from it's not us, it's the state. And in order to continue working in this industry in Massachusetts, these are the new table stakes. You're either going to get the vaccine or you're not. You're either going to get a religious or medical exemption or you're not. And if you don't, you simply can't go to work on November 1st. So it really just kind of turned into us explaining very clearly what the timelines were and what the consequences were. From there, if people were still interested in getting their vaccine, we continued to have those conversations around encouragement. And then a couple of things that we did to try and really enhance encouragement and participation in vaccination was we have a vaccine lottery. So anybody who submits their vaccine record is automatically entered into a lottery that will be announced in mid-November. First prize is $5,000. Second prize, $2,500. Third, $1,000. We got a lot of vaccination records submitted after that. We have some levers to pull with bonuses, with pay rate increases. We have paid time off if you take Care Academy's COVID-19 vaccine education class. You have paid time off to go get your vaccine, paid time off to recover from any side effects. You name it, we have supported it financially and PTO-wise with our staff. And I am encouraged, as I said earlier, to see that the number's ticking up, because really, we just want to see people continue working. And we're up against a state mandate. We're doing everything we can to keep people employed and retain the great caregivers we have. But we know that we can't make people change their minds if they don't want to.
Sounds like the magic word there is support, which I find to be really pivotal in a lot of how these conversations and rollouts are working. Moe, in your experience, what sort of support techniques are you recommending or seeing with the companies with whom you work?
A lot of the support with the companies I work with is based in just meeting the staff where they're at and having, like Kiana said earlier, right, like having the conversation, showing that you care, and looking at what information can be provided to help them understand, like Kevin mentioned, and then providing them with a robust accommodations process so that way they have a path to move forward if they do have a conflict, and that's an opportunity for that agency or that business. That in itself is challenging. And there are many different processes that have to be considered. I mean, really, we're flying the plane while we're building it. So this is very much of a learning process across the board in terms of that building the process, supporting the employees through it. And then is there anything truly concrete outside of that? I think with the amount of misinformation, like we already said, it is very challenging to look beyond that. And I know that Kevin already mentioned like all these different types of ways to try to engage with the employees, right, and offer those incentives too. And I mean that's part of building the plane and flying it and trying to find the best path forward. And how do we do that? So I have seen a lot of that with the clients, and just I think bottom line it just comes back to like how do we work with our staff so that we know that they're human, we're human, and how to best support them.
That makes sense. Really individualizing the approach for individual employees, specific communities, specific companies. It sounds like that level of customization is essential for success. So I'm curious, how or what resources are you using, Moe, to overcome misinformation? And what's the number one piece of misinformation and how are you overcoming it?
That's a good question. I think in terms of overcoming the misinformation, truly that ends up being part of the business's decision on how, if they're going to take that any further or if they're going to look at it or just throw it out and say, okay, you know what, this is what this person believes. And so I think it really comes back to the legal aspect of the process of accommodating an exemption request and having a legal team to support the business in that, but also looking at like what is the burden to the business for actually, I would say, approving those accommodations. And I know that's a big factor for our clients right now. So there's really, it's a challenging path.
Yeah. Again, support individualization. There's kind of the thesis that we're coming up against today. A couple more questions coming in. How are private pay agencies subject to these mandates and deadlines, knowing that Kevin operates a private pay agency in a state with its own deadlines? You know, we've heard from him what his experience has been. Kevin, do you have anything to add on that piece?
Yeah, so again, it's that tightrope walk between contemplation of the federal regs, which, as we have mentioned, with respect to OSHA, that's not been finalized yet. There's a lot of stuff flying around in the chat here. I know everybody's got OSHA top of mind, OSHA. However, at this point, we're only looking at the state mandate here because I can't deal with the federal until it's all finalized. And so working through the state test, because my company, yes, we are privately owned. We do have private pay clients, but we do work with state-funded Medicaid clients as well, which means we are 100% automatically lumped into that mandate, and we're treating all employees as if they could work on any Medicaid client at any moment. So we're going to treat it all the same. So that is kind of the the lens through which we are viewing things as a company that is both private pay and state-funded.
I like that method of keeping it flat, keep it simple, applicable more broadly. And I would imagine that also makes for a more flexible staffing model that allows you to address anybody's needs with any type of caregiver.
Yes, it does. And I think, one of the things that I have not seen asked yet in the chat that's sort of along these lines in terms of how we're applying the logic or how we're applying the standard at the company. Most companies now in Massachusetts, all new hires are vaccinated. What's the point of hiring an unvaccinated person after October 31st in this state? There is no point. They can't go to work. And so, we talk about things like mandates. Well, again, this is another market-based mandate now where, yes, there was a state mandate. We see more and more people asking for vaccinated aides. In order for an aide to, come out of a home health aide training program and enter this workforce, now they know. It's no different than getting a TB test or a physical at this point. It's part of that pre-hire requirement now, whether that's been officialized or not. That's how most employers are treating it. And so we're going to continue to see that number of people entering the industry with vaccines.
That's interesting. I would imagine that Kiana's sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, working in a state that has conflicting guidance with the federal requirements. Kiana, what's your approach like in that situation?
Very cautiously, very carefully. This is why we were on the call yesterday. But like Kevin, we already said we're not hiring anyone that's not vaccinated. So we already took that approach when all of this came out before we had the executive order from the governor. Just because it looks like that's probably what's going to happen from a federal standpoint. We know a lot of these things will be challenged, but right now we'll just deal with the 25% that are not vaccinated, and we're not going to add to that list. And so right now we're just doing things very, very carefully under the guidance of what legal is advising us, and then making sure, I put in the chat, documentation, make sure that we're in a agreement and alliance with the ADA, making sure we have those exemptions, and then having that communication. The other thing that the legal advises, not because of the fact when it comes to we're not hiring people that are not vaccinated, not necessarily making that decision on the interview, but after you've already given them the job and they've accepted it, then you can just ask them for their proof of vaccination at that point, because they said you have to be very, very careful to make sure you're in alliance with the ADA. So just being very careful, basically.
Yeah, very careful documentation, a compliance manager's favorite thing to hear, and then having those policies in place. And it sounds like having them evolve and checking in with that policy or series of procedures regularly to stay current with the ever-changing environment.
The other thing I was going to say is we are with the Pulsanelli group, and they have a COVID specific package. I don't know if it's 40 page, 80 pages. It's a very big package, very helpful for employers so that we can meet this requirement, especially if it goes through with this OSHA ETS. So that, and just whoever your legal advisor is, I definitely say meet with them because there's a lot of documentation that's required.
Thanks, Kiana. Moe, I see you're off mute. Please throw down.
No, I was actually just going to weigh in and just really strongly agree with the documentation piece, especially with the way that the policies and procedures and even the process as to which maybe an exemption is deemed eligible or ineligible is critical for the success of that entire the accommodation piece. Ultimately, if you can't reflect back on why certain decisions were made or when the process changed, then that will be leaving a lot of room for risk. And so we have definitely been highly focused on that during some of these projects, but more importantly, the ability to capture the process change, because one day and we may want to follow one path and the next day it changes, and what has been very helpful is actually to sometimes take a step back during that process and say, okay, you know what, let's re-review and make sure that we have consistency and that we're capturing the themes across all of the requests appropriately. And it can be challenging when looking at those accommodation requests and exemption requests to have the right lens as well.
That's interesting. And it actually dovetails really nicely into a question that just came in about documentation for exemption requests. What evidence needs to be provided? What justification does there need to be? What sort of policies are being developed to support that?
Really, it depends first on the regulation, right? So number one, and number two, on the actual policies and procedures that are being built. And so part of there's no one size fits all answer for that, especially if you're in a state where maybe they're looking at I believe we said the conscience, aspect, not just religious, medical, but then what does that mean? And how does the agency or business define that, matching it up against the reg, and then being able to guide that process so you have all the individuals involved or whoever is involved looking at it the same way. So it's a really it's a tough question to give like a very clear answer, but I think if you look at those components, that will be helpful in helping for that path.
That's really interesting. Again, comes down to individualization, working with the legal team, and having a defensible position that is examined on a regular basis. It makes sense in the context of the rest of it. So I wonder then, this is a question that just came in, who is liable if an employee has an adverse reaction to a vaccine that was mandated? Is an employer required to provide PTO to cover side effects? What if side effects are severe or extended? What have you seen in your experience so far, Moe and Kevin and Kiana, respectively?
For me and my clients, it's really actually been most of the employees have actually gone through the exemption and accommodation process. So we have not really seen any go down the other path and this, the liability aspect. So I think that would be maybe a question for Kevin and Kiana, if you guys have seen that.
I have not seen it, not at our agency, although, everybody sues for everyone, everyone's liable. So it'll be interesting to watch. What I have seen in just my research, it seems like the courts and everything have been pretty favorable towards the employers and towards whatever the mandates are. That's what it's looking like in cases where people have been doing the challenges. So that's what I'm seeing on my end.
Yeah, I agree with that, Kiana. Again, we lean into the fact that this was a state-imposed mandate, a federally imposed mandate. These are not employer mandates, and therefore, I personally would be quick to shift liability away from my own company. I'm not an attorney, nor do I claim to be one, so I can't, say with certainty what would or would not happen. But I think we can all look back to spring of 20, when all of our aides and all of our clients were getting COVID and nobody knew who had it first or where they got it. I wasn't being sued then, and we were just being asked to go in and deliver the service. So, I'm not. That's not a top of mind issue for me at the moment.
In the world of competing priorities, there are plenty of priorities that kind of win out over that one. And it kind of, I guess, comes back to that policy side. And it sounds like there are other ways too to support employees, as Kevin mentioned earlier, between PTO and supports. And I know the federal executive order did mention being able to support employees through the vaccination process. So depending on which state you're in, that may apply to you. We did have a question come in that mentioned, are the mandates only for agencies with 100+ employees? What if we're an assisted living facility with 60 employees? And to that question, it depends on which state you're in. You can look at either a state-specific mandate and or a federal mandate. The federal mandate I can speak to, not knowing which state this person is coming from. The federal mandate is for employers, private companies with more than 100 employees, or healthcare company, and companies that provide healthcare services that accept reimbursement from CMS. So if this assisted living facility is under 100 employees, they wouldn't necessarily apply to the private the private employer rule, but under the healthcare facility rule, if they are taking reimbursements from CMS, they would count as a healthcare facility and thus have to work with those federal mandates. Again, very carefully if in a state like Texas where there's conflicting guidance. Another question, who is responsible for the cost of weekly testing, the employer or the employee? And I think this is something that is still being figured out. I believe it was mentioned in the federal mandate, but I think states may or may not be providing additional guidance on that. Can any of our panelists today speak to testing accommodations and costs thereof?
So the way we've handled these testing, because the testing is not new for us, because CMS had already mandated the testing when it came to nursing facilities. And so many of our home care providers provide services in these facilities, so we had to comply as well. So we were already used to doing weekly and in some cases bi-weekly testing. So it was a little crazy, but, and that wasn't for all our employees, but we still had a certain percentage. Now we were really utilizing Walgreens and CVS, which were free, which was quite easy to manage until numbers went high. So when numbers went high, it made it a little bit more difficult for them to actually get tests. We acquired some tests as well. We got CLIA certified so that we could administer our own tests. That was quite expensive. I know we paid about $1,700 to get 100 COVID tests and have those on hand for emergency situations. And they were very helpful. I was so glad we were able to get that. But in the event that someone needed to be tested like twice a week and they could get that first test scheduled, but not the second one, we could go out and swab them. Now, what's different and what's new is we were able to work with our local chamber, the Pearland Chamber. The government has been giving some chambers COVID tests, and they're I think it's called the Abbott COVID tests, and they're for free. And they gave our chamber, I think, $3,000 for our community. And so we had to, it's very regulated. You have to get tested. And there's a proper procedure that you have to do in order to be able to administer it. And the information needs to be reported to the government. But it was very, very helpful because we do have access for those. Again, because it's a limited quantity. So I think we got like 80. We keep them on hand for emergency cases. But I would definitely reach out to your local chamber and see if they're participating in that program. It's directly with the government.
What a great resource. Any other thoughts or resources, Moe or Kevin, around testing and providing that type of support?
Go ahead, Moe.
No, I mean, I think that what Kiana, what she shared was very valuable, and looking at those types of opportunities to find testing in the community, but it's hard to, identify anything that's like nationwide at this point, or that's readily available across the board. So I hesitate to discuss that further.
I think that the takeaway, based on what we just heard Kiana say, both from an expense standpoint and from an implementation standpoint, testing is an administrative burden to the nth degree. It's not something that any of us, I think, would look forward to in lieu of an employee getting a vaccine. Coordinating that, paying for that, simply being involved in that process is burdensome for employers. And so in Massachusetts, the way that the mandate hit our industry was vaccine or exemption. There was no language surround weekly testing. Weekly testing could be an accommodation if an employer chooses to implement it. But until the feds say anything that would, take precedent over what was mandated here in Massachusetts, you're not going to see a lot of home care employers pivot to a weekly test. I think that many of us will be using either vaccines or exemptions plus PPE.
It's really interesting, especially since it really is so specific to the state, and there is a massive burden. Moe, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, that's also what I've experienced with my clients. They're looking, and but however, to add, outside of healthcare, a lot of businesses are looking for that testing as a priority, and then kind of thinking, okay, if they're willing to test, then hopefully they're also willing to mask, and being able to look at that from a different perspective. And also looking at, of course, the ability to work remote, but really the testing is the priority if on-site is needed for those individuals. So in terms of frequency, that's up to the business, and if there's the regulations that specify anything at any point.
So always taking that regulatory framework into consideration, and then looking at what your options are. Because I know with the first federal executive order, there was a testing accommodation, and with the most recent one released, that testing accommodation was removed. So that shift seems to be indicative of what practice is rolling out as well. Couple questions about audits. Which entity will audit companies? That's a great question, and I think it will apply to whichever sort of group that you fit into, depending on if it's state or if it's federal. So if it's a private company with more than 100 employees and you're not taking CMS reimbursements, then you're looking to OSHA. If you are a healthcare company and you are taking CMS reimbursements, you're looking to CMS. You may also be looking at OSHA. You could also be looking to a state-specific OSHA as well if you're in a state like California. So we have yet to see what kind of overlap and what type of audits, but those are the two main entities for our group today. Panelists, if you have anything to add or contribute to that, please go right ahead. Looking through some other questions that come in as well. So how can employers manage all the vaccine and exemption documentation and the audit process? That's a big question, and it's fraught with complications. Are there any tricks, tools, resources, or guidance that y'all can provide?
Use technology. Find a really good application that either is built or being built or can be built internally, and leverage that, and be prepared to make very quick changes, because that is quite a process to get in place, and making sure that you capture the right information and that everything meets the legal requirements as well. So that would be certainly the first step.
Right, I agree with her. When everything happened in March of 2020, I felt like we were changing policies and procedures like multiple times a week. We were on legal calls multiple times a month, and we were constantly updating policies and having our clients sign things and having our caregiver sign things, and then it's outdated and they have to sign something else. So you might have to hire a little extra help. I had actually hired some extra help in that February, unbeknownst to me. So that was so helpful because all of that started happening in March. I did have that extra hand in place, which I had that person just really dedicate to watching all of that.
I would also say, and I don't think this has come up in the chat. If it has, I apologize. Maybe I overlooked it, but to follow this thread of documentation, as your schedulers or whoever the people at your company are who have the most frequent touch with your aides, typically schedulers at our company, have phone conversations. If they're not doing it in email or if they're talking on the phone, make sure they document in writing if somebody is going to not get a vaccine, or if somebody is not going to work because of the vaccine mandate, because we have no idea how unemployment is going to shake out. That's the huge unknown in all of this. What are these unemployment claims going to look and feel like for us post-mandate when on November 1st, all these aides who have exited the industry are going to go file for unemployment? In speaking to our reps and attorneys, we feel somewhat confident that they will have an uphill battle when trying to seek unemployment benefits as a result of noncompliance with a mandate or willingness to leave an industry or a job because of a mandate. But again, the more you document, the better you prepare yourselves on that front, because one of the great hidden costs for all of us in this whole COVID experience that we live is the unemployment piece. So just something to be cognizant of.
And just to add to that about the technology, and we utilize ClearCare. So it's very easy for us when we went through and we surveyed to find out which of our caregivers were vaccinated and not vaccinated. We just simply added a tag in the system. And so we're able to just look at the tags and it'll show whether vaccinated or not. And then we add a note to our client's profile. And then that was very easy for us. We don't have to go into their file or anything like that. It's already labeled.
Those are some really great tools. Thank you so much for sharing those. We did get a question that came in around fraudulent vaccine cards. Is this something that any of you have seen? And if so, how are you handling it?
Thankfully, I have not seen that. So lame. I mean, we have not gotten one. Maybe we have actually. I don't know, because I put in the chat that I don't feel it's the employer responsibility to start vetting the legitimacy of a vaccine card. I don't know how I would do that. I don't have forensic analysis as one of our service offerings here at Best of Care to be able to, not to be too glib, but to be able to even, contemplate or spend time right now thinking about whether it's real or not. We're not doing that at the moment.
I actually have some fake vaccine cards, just so
Wow.
interesting. I ordered the vaccine card holder just for my vaccine card, and it sent a whole bunch of little vaccine cards. And this was, oh gosh, probably 6 or 7 months ago. But that was the first time I thought about it. And I was like, I bet people are filling out fake ones. I'd never thought about it before. So I'm sure there's a market. I'm almost for certain we intercepted one person, but I can't remember, unfortunately. But like Kevin says, we just do our due diligence the way we would our due diligence when it comes to are they using legitimate passports and driver's license. If it looks too out of the ordinary, you might can say something. But other than that, we're just trying to comply at this point.
To tag on to that too, I mean, that the same kind of thought process when it comes to the actual exemptions and accommodations. Like if it's a religious exemption that's being requested, then who's going to say that that's not the religion of that person and their truly held beliefs, and why they feel that the vaccine is in contradiction with their religious beliefs, right? So I think it's about as a business, like looking at, do we have sufficient information to apply the policy and the regs? Then it kind of becomes more of a good check the box, so that you can move it forward without actually like doing the in the weeds, like, is this accurate or not interpretation?
It's almost maybe a conversation with legal that says, as to Kevin's point, we're not in the business of forensic analysis of vaccine cards. We simply have this statement. We've done our due diligence. We've checked the box. We've addressed the policy. And then, to Kiana's point earlier, to pivot as needed. And if you're seeing a pattern and if you're seeing something different, to change and adapt to those shifts. Another question came in about testing. As if it is an accepted alternative, are store-bought tests acceptable? What kind of tests have you guys used? Obviously, we may not all be using them still today, but what have you used historically? I know, Kiana, you had some insights on that earlier.
Yeah, I really didn't see any regulation about them. I know early on we were really encouraging people to do the PCR just because of the unreliability of the rapids. But when it became so many people, so many facilities requiring weekly and biweekly, they didn't really look at, the test specifically. So, I mean, we've used the LabCorp. LabCorp has a nice one, Pixel. You can go online, it'll come directly to your house. You can take the test, you can send it in. They'll even have FedEx come and pick it up from your house. You can use your insurance for it, or if you didn't have insurance, it was free. We've used the store-bought ones. You can get those Abbott store-bought ones in the store as well. I just really didn't see any regulation. It just seemed like it was more of a check the box for the facilities. Now, as far as with the government and these mandates, I'm again, none of these things are final. So we're waiting to see exactly what they're going to say, if they're going to have specific types, but so far I haven't seen that.
I think that answers that question pretty thoroughly. Thank you, Kiana. As we near the top of the hour, I'm going to switch gears and ask each of you about a story or an experience or something that's really impacted you that you'd like to share with the group over the last, several weeks or months. It's been a dynamic time for all of us, including and especially those of us in healthcare and in home care. Please share something about that that really had an impression or an impact on you.
I don't have a story in particular, but I will just say, just going through this process, we've seen the ugly, unfortunately. And I think a lot of time with social media and, all this misinformation, a lot of times we just really concentrate on the ugly. But I think it's great when we actually look at the positives, and look at the good. We as America, we're not used to going through things like this. Yes, I say we're spoiled in America, but we're not used to going through this. And we did. And we thought initially this is just going to be for 2 weeks. And then, we hunker down and then it's over, and it's still going. And there's like no end in sight. But I like to look at how we've all come together, we see the clients, the caregivers. So many caregivers went out of their way to make sure that their clients were taken care of. We've had caregivers put their lives at risk by taking care of their client that might have became positive, and the caregivers didn't know whether or not they would get sick, but they stayed in the homes. That's not the case with every case, but a lot of them did, because their concern was to make sure that their clients were okay. And so we see all of these things, and I just like to think about the positives and how this has brought us together as a people to really pull together and try to look at solutions and try to make sure that people are safe.
Thank you, Kiana.
I agree that I don't have a particular story or anecdote that sticks out, other than, I hope that the thoughts that I've shared today have all been centered around our company's goal of helping all of our aides get through this, specifically this mandate process right now, with like the least amount of friction, right? If you can get a religious or medical exemption, go ahead and please try to get that. If you can get the vaccine because you want to get it, we will make every accommodation to help you get it, find it for you, get you there, pay you for your time off, all of those things, because what's sometimes lost in all this and the mandates and what we want the people to do is the fact that these aides have stuck it out, as Kiana said, for going on 2 years now, working through just insanity. And this job was already the most thankless job on the planet. And then it became even more than that somehow. And so, again, our goal is just, let's get through this thing together. Let's see how many of us come out on the other side of these mandates. And hopefully for those who need more time to think about it, you'll be back. And we will be happy to have you come back. And I think that's been sort of the message and the through line that our company has shared in our words and in our communications with staff.
Thank you, Kevin.
I'm going to also kind of reaffirm what Kevin was saying too. I mean, as working with my clients, there's a lot of like, hey, we don't have the workforce and we're having all these, these challenges with staffing. But then, I sit back and I say, hey, well, as a nurse, I mean, I was in the hospitals last year and the staffing was challenging then, and we were pulling together as a team. And now we're still continuing to just work through this, and the impact to healthcare, in my opinion, is the strongest across the industries when it comes to the mandate and also the implications of the mandate to the workforce. So I think it's about just knowing that, we have people on both sides of the table and trying to work together to get through the exemption and accommodation process. So that way, so that we can move past this and help the people that are taking care of the patients, help the employees, help your people, right? Have that peace of mind as well. So that way we can come out of a place where I think a lot of folks are worried and stressed out by this right now and are concerned about losing their jobs. So I know that wasn't exactly a story, but that's really the themes and the feelings that have come out from working on these processes.
And I was going to say, as business owners, this has given us the opportunity to step up, really step up and be leaders in our organization. We went through times when, and still going through it, so many people were anxious. They're not only having to deal with this at work, they're having to deal with this at home. They're losing their loved ones. They have loved ones in the hospital. They're afraid that if I go to work, because I have to feed my family, so I have to go to work, that's not an option. Am I going to bring this disease home to my family? In a lot of our demographics, they have comorbidities and they have all these different things. They were subjected to, if they get sick, it could wipe them out, So being the leaders and being there for our staff, it really gave us the opportunity to just really step up. And then understanding the heavy weight that the business owners, especially in home care, are having to deal with, because the decisions that we were making in many cases can be life and death decision. Am I advising my employees correctly? Am I giving them the information? Are they working safely? Am I advising my clients correctly? The decisions we make, if we don't make the right decision, we can put them in danger. So it's a heavy, heavy, weighty responsibility.
Thank you, Kiana. I really appreciate that. I don't think there's a better note to end on. Change is hard. We must collaborate and be compassionate and work together to problem solve through this. A little bit of grace goes a long way. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, panelists, for joining me today. Thank you, attendees, for joining us and asking such stimulating questions. It's been super informative for me, and I know for a number of other people. So thank you, everyone. I look forward to the next time we can meet again and have another conversation around vaccines or how we confront other prevalent changes in our industry. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.